Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. Thank you for staying for the main event in the main room. Why is Britain not growing? Question of the day. I'm Joe Hill. I'm the policy director at Restate, and I'm chairing this panel. We have a kind of all-star guest lineup here to discuss this really important issue. Starting at the far end, we have Sam Bowman, who's founder of Works in Progress and also head of publishing at Stride Press. Rian Whitton, who's a research analyst at Bismarck Analysis, and Mark McVitie, director of the Labour Growth Group. I don't think I need to tell anyone why this is such a big and important issue. It feels like since the first Civic Future conference 2 years ago, this is an issue which has moved like far more into the mainstream of British public policy. The government of the day have a target to be the fastest growing of the G7 economies, a sort of best of a bad bunch relative target. Meanwhile, in very real terms, we're about a third poorer than the average American. Living standards have stagnated for kind of almost 15 years now in this country, and we have assembled a panel of experts to tell us why and how we fix it. A couple of the panelists have told me we're not just going to be repeating the kind of great and the good normal remarks of British growth policy, and hopefully we're going to get a couple of kind of new thoughts from each of them. I'm going to ask them to give kind of brief opening remarks. I'll do some questions. We'll take questions from the audience and the Slido link as well. If we go, Sam, first, why is Britain not growing?
Great, thanks very much. I feel a little bit like the band Aha, who almost everybody knows for their one-hit wonder Take On Me, but has an incredibly deep and experimental back catalogue of albums. And whenever they perform, they always want to play their progressive, exciting, experimental work while the crowd just shouts, play Take On Me, do Take On Me. So I'm not going to just talk about the fact that not building houses and data centres and laboratory space is why the UK is poor. I think at this stage, if you're in this room, you are at least familiar with that argument, and you'll have your own views on whether that's important. What I am interested in is why so many of these things seem to have broken in fairly similar but not exactly similar ways. So it can be very easy to blame planning and say that the planning system is the problem. And the planning system is, in many cases, a very significant problem, but it is by no means the only problem for any of these things. So take a nuclear power station, for example. A nuclear power station does indeed need to get planning permission to be built from the local authority. And this can be difficult because people don't usually want to live near a nuclear power station. Interestingly, after a nuclear power station has been built, people are very keen for the nuclear power station to remain there because they realize that it brings very, very highly paid and sophisticated jobs. But before the nuclear power station arrives, they can be less enthusiastic. But before you get to that stage, you need to get approval from the Office for Nuclear Regulation, which is, I think, probably the most malignant regulator in the UK. I had no experience of it until about 12 months ago. And now I realize that it is actually an organization that has sort of evolved purely to survive. If you are a licensee, if you are a nuclear power company trying to get approval for a reactor design from the Office for Nuclear Regulation, you can take weeks to get a response on the most basic questions. If, as I have learned a number of times, you criticize the Office for Nuclear Regulation on Twitter, you will immediately get a phone call from the Office for Nuclear Regulation. If you write an article that has a paragraph in it vaguely criticizing the Office for Nuclear Regulation, you will get a number of emails from them very rapidly asking them to correct, even though you haven't made a mistake and even though they don't have one to tell you about. Once you have permission from the Office for Nuclear Regulation to build the reactor that you want, which may involve years of waiting, may involve excruciating changes to existing reactor designs that are already working and already have years and years of completely safe operational time in other countries, like Japan, for example. If you eventually get permission to build your reactor, then you have to go through the environmental approval process. This never ends. So once you have begun building, even if you have persuaded the environmental authority that what you are building will not be especially bad for the local environment, they have an unlimited ability to constantly change what you are doing and constantly request changes to your approval process or to your design for extremely trivial things. So people here are possibly familiar with this famous example of a fish disco, a microphone underwater that was deemed to be the best way to stop fish from being sucked into the cooling intake of Hinkley Point C. It was decided that this would save something like 300 endangered fish a year. Would actually increase the risk to human life because the only way to do maintenance on this microphone was by having a diver go down and tinker with it every few months. But the point is that this process never ends. While you are building a nuclear reactor, the Office for Nuclear Regulation can come back and request more changes. The environmental regulator can come back and request more changes. Other people can, at any point, judicially review what has happened to see if what you've done has followed the law and has been lawful, which might sound okay, but really usually means, did you read every single consultation response? Can you show that you have done that? Can you show that you've taken kind of due measures in response to every objection raised in the consultation, and so on? So that's one example. But the point is, it's not just planning. Planning is one part of the problem, but it's not the only one. For HS2, for example, the £100 billion train line, for some reason it was decided that this high-speed rail line should run at 60 kilometers per hour faster than comparable lines in Europe. No particular reason for that. There's no particular urgency in getting from London to Birmingham or even London to Manchester faster than French people can go from Paris to Marseille. It was just that the people designing the project wanted that. Crossrail has won numerous architectural awards for the brilliance of its stations, and they are pretty impressive, but they're also the most expensive train stations ever built. And Crossrail, unsurprisingly, is the second most expensive metro line ever built. And if you do want to bring a judicial review challenge against any of these projects, you can bring up to 3. Your legal costs are, your legal damages if you lose, which you almost always will, are capped at £10,000, thanks to an international convention that we're a member of. And you bear no cost whatsoever based on the costs that you have created for the project. So even if your delays via your judicial review creates billions of pounds of costs for the project, you bear none of that. There is no penalty for bringing vexatious or failed judicial reviews. So the argument that I would like to make and leave you with is that the underlying problem with all of these things is that the relationship between decision-making and costs has been broken. And this is what economists would call an externalities problem when it takes place in the private sector. When decisions are made by the Office for Nuclear Regulation, the costs that they create are not borne or imposed on them in any way. When you bring a judicial review, the costs that you create for society and for the project that you are challenging are not borne by you in any way. I was amazed to learn when we were writing an essay that I was involved with last year called Foundations, that the Town and Country Planning Act, which I have seen, and many people I think correctly see as the kind of original sin in UK housing and UK planning, the Town and Country Planning Act did not introduce, as I believed it had, the powers for local councils to block new developments. They had those powers for decades before the Town and Country Planning Act was introduced. What it did was remove a requirement that they compensate landowners when they blocked landowners from building on their land. So prior to 1947, a local council could say, no, you may not build a skyscraper in this area, it's not appropriate. But if they did, they would have to compensate you for that. They would bear some of the costs that they were imposing on you as a landowner. And what the Town and Country Planning Act did was divorce that link. The decision-making was no longer related to the consequences of the decision-making. And I think we see this in the way we fund infrastructure. It comes from the centre. You essentially get a blank check from the Treasury and you can spend it on whatever you want. And if engineers are making the decisions, engineers will go for the fastest trains they possibly can and will ignore the costs. This is true of almost all engineers. They're wonderful, but they're not the most price-conscious people on earth. I think this is true for the Office for Nuclear Regulation. This is true both in the US and in the UK when it comes to local government keeping the taxes that they raise. Since the Second World War, we have made it less and less the case that local governments keep the money that they raise from new buildings in their areas, so they have much less of an incentive to allow that. I think it's even true when we look at much more macro level things that don't directly relate to economic growth, like immigration. I think the ECHR is an excellent example of an institution that by design is insulated from the consequences of its decisions. And I think as a result is making increasingly strange, the court is making increasingly strange and increasingly damaging decisions that are making people increasingly angry. And finally, when I look at the world and I look at areas that seem to do things well, like, for example, Israel, which does densification extremely well and has a very popular and very, very widely used densification program, or Madrid, which was able to build a metro or extend its metro by 120 miles in about 12 years for something between an eighth and a tenth of the price that we've paid for Crossrail per mile. Or France, which manages to build tramways in cities equivalent in size to Carlisle. All of these do this by having a very, very large share of local decision-making plus local spending and local retention of the benefits. And I think it's that, not because the local governments are better, not because even local governments necessarily have more information, but because local governments bear the cost of the decisions and the errors that they make. And I think that when we think about restoring growth to the UK, and we think about what mechanisms could make us rich again, I think they are mechanisms that will restore feedback loops and incentives for decision makers to keep costs low and to allow things to be built. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Mark, I was going to come to you next, if that's right. A year in this week to a Labour government, why does the government think Britain's not growing? Are they right?
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted a really broad analysis of why the government think Britain isn't growing, why the Treasury think Britain isn't growing, I think that they would point to an effective ban on investment that has occurred in the UK over the past 14 years during the period the Tories were in power, and that we are taking steps to reverse that via the change we're making to the planning laws, change we're making through the pensions and liberalising regulations, all of which are there's a truth to that, right? I would say that what isn't entirely present probably in the government's analysis, which would be the main thrust of my point as to why the country's economy has stagnated the way that it has, is that the fundamental problems, the things that you see, like the fact that we have the highest energy costs in the developed world, the fact that we have really, really reams and reams of contradictory and stifling regulation, and the fact that it's so difficult to build anything for innumerable reasons, including planning and regulation. All of these are things which are ultimately downstream of dysfunction, which occurs at a systems level in Westminster and Whitehall. So the interaction of the political system with the system of government, i.e. the capacity of the state and the civil service, and the media ecosystem, which binds those together, creates a situation in which there's one bad decision on top of another is consistently made, which creates bad policy, which stifles growth, stifles innovation, stifles building, and this repeats and repeats and repeats until compounds until we have the situation that we've ended up in. There's within all of these institutions, there are huge problems of incentives. The incentives are basically for everyone are in the wrong place. Incentives in the civil service highly weighted towards risk aversion as opposed to taking risks to solve issues. Political incentives, which are partially driven by the media, are often incredibly short term, incredibly short sighted. Politicians, by design of the system in Westminster, are effectively the system in Westminster and Parliament tries to ensure that politicians don't do too much thinking about anything, and would really like them to basically spend most of their time sticking their head through cardboard cutouts of the Duolingo mascot and like throwing like comedy-sized darts at a board to do with their constituency. Like these are not the activities of lawmakers in a G7 economy. And the system is designed for that. It does not encourage thinking or challenging ideas, or thinking about the systems of power and governance. And Tory MPs, in particular, spent like 14 years complaining quite a lot about how difficult they found it to govern and doing absolutely nothing about it. And like an example of this, just to sort of set this whole thing within a context, is like the second staircase rule, which applies to new build tower blocks of housing, right? The second staircase rule was a policy which was enacted in the wake of the Grenfell disaster. So the bringing in of this policy was driven by a ministerial desire to be seen to be doing something about something that had just happened, which the media was driving a furore about and demanding that something must be done. This is a chronic problem in politics and in Westminster Whitehall. Something certainly must be done. Let's not think too much about what, but something. And so a minister says to civil servants, "What have you got? Give me a policy." And they come up with this thing, which by its own by the own cost benefit analysis that was done on it, for every life that could potentially be saved by the second staircase policy, the cost is up to £1.6 billion. So it's hugely out of whack. There's very little evidence that it would have saved a single life in the actual example of Grenfell, and it now, in the time since it's been enacted, has suppressed house building, has suppressed growth through the impact that's had on development, and ultimately that suppresses the well-being of the British people, right? All because it's been driven by a bunch of systems working together that are all dysfunctional. So at the heart of these systems, ultimately, particularly this is incumbent upon the political system, is that the core priorities of the people that put you there should be what drives decision making. And there's some very clear priorities that British people have had for a long time. Bringing down the cost of living or raising living standards, whichever way you want to put it. Dealing with issues that are examples of state failure, like rampant petty crime in lots of communities up and down the country. There's communities which are no longer prosperous and run down, and as a result of lack of infrastructure being built across the country, et cetera, and bringing down immigration. These are really core things, and politicians should be testing their decisions against these core priorities, not responding to these really short-term incentives that are driven through media cycles. And similarly, the civil service must be reformed to focus on delivering the priorities, once again, of the British people, because that's ultimately who we're all there to serve. So I think my contention is very much that this is a systems level problem that finds its roots within these effectively ossified institutions, and that changing the inputs to these systems will not in and of itself solve our problem. Different politicians or different media figures, some fresh blood in the civil service isn't going to move the needle on this. You need to make some fundamental changes to the way that these operate and interlink and work together.
Fantastic, thank you. And final opening remarks from Ryan, who said last night he wanted to give us a longer view of history and kind of where we are and where we're going on this.
Yeah, well, thanks everyone for coming. I think we're obviously interested in growth because it's so elusive, and when we're sort of looking from the bird's eye view, there's reasons for that go beyond the dysfunction of the British state or British business or British regulation. I think it's worth noting that, among other European countries, the same conversations are being had, right? Italy hasn't really grown since 2000, right? There's been some like tangential growth in Spain and in Portugal, but it's not particularly sustainable. The description of this talk noted that Britain was a high tax, high spend country and a low growth country. And the implication of that is that we can become a low tax, low spend country, or maybe a high spend country, depending on your political persuasions, and we can become a high growth country again. I think it's worth noting that while taxes as a share of GDP are relatively high from a historical perspective for us, they're not high compared to other European countries or comparators. When you look at government investment as a share of GDP, it's not particularly high. And yeah, when you factor in, where like the British sort of growth rates are, although they're not particularly good, they're kind of, within the range of what we'd expect from an OECD country. And obviously the United States gets mentioned as sort of the great sort of, comparable, right? US growth has been very good since 2008. I think that has to be caveated because that is built on a very aggressive fiscal policy and an absolute mountain of debt. Now, is that debt going to be repaid? I'm not really a macroeconomist. Most macroeconomists seem to think it's fine. Elon Musk doesn't think it's fine. Maybe he's right, maybe they're wrong, maybe it's the other way around. But if we tried to pursue such an aggressive fiscal policy, we just have a rolling conveyor belt of trust governments sort of going in and out of number 10 and, generally being dysfunctional. I think it's also worth noting that globally, the stall in demographic growth is going to make growth more elusive for most countries going forward and much harder to generate. There's a very good sort of set of slides and a very good symposium that came from the University of Columbia by a guy called Jesus Fernandez Villaverde. And he suggested that the UN projections for population growth in the 21st century were wildly over-optimistic, and that in 2023, that was the first year where global fertility actually fell below replacement rate. And his suggestion is that the global population will peak around 2055. Now, obviously, you can get higher productivity. We can get, Sam Altman to help us out. But when you've got debt to GDP ratios in excess of 100% or even moving up to 150%, it's total output that matters, right? And if a portion of the population become wildly more productive, they're going to have to be taxed because there's going to be a lot of people who are less productive and who are just older. And I think this shouldn't be a suggestion that we shouldn't think about growth or that we shouldn't aspire to growth or that there aren't ways to unlock growth. But I think the way we've been talking about getting growth for the last 100 years or so, looking at sort of, headline GDP and looking at how we can pay it off, in some sense, I think that will have to change radically in the next 50 years. I'm not sure it'll be entirely sustainable. Now, on to Britain, right? What are the things that, mark us out as particularly dysfunctional? Well, there are a lot of things that we actually, do that is considered best practice, right? There's no real protectionism here, almost none at all. It's not even sort of a consideration. In the US, you have whole government departments that are basically tariff hawks. That's just not true in Britain at all. We are unbelievably welcoming of foreign ownership. 65% of British equities are foreign owned. We let US private equity groups buy out our defense companies. We're not, proving particularly good at even fighting for British companies being on the London Stock Exchange. AstraZeneca's moving to the US. And we're also very open to immigration historically, right? Compared to most countries, we've had pretty high immigration rates. We have a university system that's designed to attract global top talent. So on many things, I think Britain has already been sort of optimizing for growth as understood by traditional economic thinking for some time. The real problem is, bunged up in energy and housing and planning. It's really just the material world. The material economy is just about four things, right? That's all you need to know about the economy. Non-organic materials like gravel, aggregates, limestone, soda ash, ceramics, metals, fossil fuels, and biomass. Like, those are the four things that go through the economy. In about 2000, like, about 700 million tons of that stuff went through the British economy every year. Today, it's more like 550 million tons. So quite a significant drop. And even if you take the decline in fossil fuels out, material consumption's gone from about 500 million tons to about 400 million tons, right? So fundamentally, if people feel that there's stagnation in the country, it's just because, there's much less material moving through the economy. And I saw like an economist piece which was complaining about our net zero rules kind of being against air conditioning. And, I sort of, chuckled at that because, what did you think net zero meant? Essays, like slam poetry. Like, if you want to meet these targets, you can't have a load of new air conditioning come online and raise consumption. And I think, we haven't thought enough about material throughput. And I think, we've allowed net zero to become our de facto industrial strategy, but it is also a veto on any other industrial strategy we might have, right? In foundations, Sam's great sort of comparable to Britain is France, which I thought is like very interesting. France indeed does have a much, more consumption of steel and cement and concrete per capita than we do. I think, why is that? Well, like, part of it's, limitations on what local governments can sort of do without getting penalized. I think one of the reasons is good old-fashioned corporatism and a big state and lots of big businesses. Britain, I think, has a bit of a dearth of big conglomerates and integrated companies that are in some way tied to Britain politically. In France, for instance, you got the three largest companies by market cap. They're all luxury companies that sell Veblen goods, right? So this would be LVMH, L'Oreal, and Hermes. Big fan of all their products. I'm a huge customer. But they are all run by families, right? That are like integrated into local and French politics. Bernard Arnault, head of LVMH, is informally the most important man in Paris as well. He's also the owner of Los Echos, which is one of the key newspapers there. He's not the owner of Le Monde, but his son-in-law is, right? So in France, we think of it as a socialist country, but it's actually a country really run by patriotic fat cats. And I think, maybe we should have a bit more of those in Britain. In the 1920s, a lot of the MPs were just people who ran collieries or owned steel mills, right? And they had a reason, right, to integrate good policy making and good regulation with industrial production. And I think that's somewhere where France is doing well. I think what's very interesting is that in the United States, the rise of dual-class shares indicates, that's really a Europeanization of sorts of, American financial practice because, dual-class shares are very popular on the continent, very popular in Sweden. They haven't been popular in the Anglosphere for some time, but they've been becoming much more popular. And I think the fact that it's now legal to do it in Britain at least creates the opportunity for founder-led big enterprises to grow and become significant. I think, however, while the establishment of these big companies will be a very good thing, I think that when we talk about supply-side reform, we have to sort of be clear that the market sensitivities might be a bit dull in this hyper-globalized world that we're in. For example, energy costs, right? Yes, it's true. Britain has really high energy costs related to anyone else, right? And it's killing our energy-intensive sector, which I focus a lot on. Like, that's about 20% of manufacturing GVA, and it's existential. Like 50%, like downturns, like across whole sectors, like they're getting killed. However, the United States is in a fantastic position on energy, unbelievably strong position. Its chemical sector and its petrochemical sector, since 2014, actually since 2008, hasn't grown at all. In fact, it's declined at pretty much the same standard per year as their Europeans, rivals, right, who are facing much higher energy costs. And the reason of that is just, frankly, overproduction in China. And it's true that as a market signal, cheap energy is a good thing to look for. It's a good thing to attain. It's a general stimulant to the economy, and high energy prices are a depressant on the economy. But I think we have to also factor in that supply side reform, without looking at global trade distortions due to Chinese overproduction, which is creating too much supply chasing too little demand, could leave us a little disappointed. And with that, I'll leave that there and we can open up the discussion.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. I'm going to have the privilege of asking one question to all the panelists, and then we're going to kind of go to the room and to the Slido. And, I don't know if the lack of questions up there is because no one's been putting them in, or they will just magically appear at some point. But if you are starting to think of questions, please get them going. The question I want to ask each panelist is, we've all got a system to blame, kind of feedback loops, political class, demographics, industrial strategy, China, you name it. The question I'm interested in is, whose fault is it? Should we blame someone? And if so, who? Is it the Treasury's fault? The Treasury's the government department responsible for the economy. The Treasury's a kind of outsized force into a spectre on British public policy. We always say it's kind of very powerful. Should it want growth? Does it want growth? If so, why don't we have it? Sam, maybe you first.
Well, obviously, ultimately, it's the voters' fault, right? I mean, it's not a particularly useful insight because those are the voters we have. I think that it isn't. I don't think it is actually that useful to think about whose fault it is. I think to kind of return to the argument I'm making, the question is: are the decision making or are the incentive structures correct, given who calls the shots? For example, voters tend to be much more friendly to and much more able to think about trade-offs when they are considering trade-offs that affect them very locally and when they capture some of the benefits as well as the costs in a very local level. We can look at South Korea, which hugely densified in the 1980s through basically just local votes that allowed slum parts of Seoul to redevelop themselves into the sort of high-rises that we now associate with Seoul and South Korea. Clearly, high-rises come with massive, massive costs. And clearly, if you make those kinds of decisions on a national level, you only really think about the costs. There's no real benefit to you for having a high-rise near you. If you change the decision-making structure so that in addition to feeling the costs, you also can feel some of the benefits, in this case because the value of your land increases a lot when you get to build a high-rise on your land, then you start to be able to think about the trade-offs in a better way. Now, maybe we can think about whose fault is it that we have broken all of those connections. I think, interestingly, I think the Thatcher government bears a lot of responsibility. I think there's a really good book by Simon Jenkins called Thatcher and Sons, and his argument is that there were two Thatcher revolutions. There's the privatization revolution that we all know and love, and there's the centralization revolution, where the government, in response to very, very left-dominated local authorities and local councils, centralized power enormously as a sort of quickest way to getting things done in the face of very, very strong local government opposition. And that left us with an extremely centralized state in which voters are almost always only asked to bear the costs and to make decisions thinking about the costs because the benefits are so dispersed and are so difficult for them to see. So my answer is really the voters are to blame, but the answer isn't to berate anybody. The answer isn't to educate anybody. The answer is to change the incentives that they face so that they benefit from the things that we want to happen as well as losing out.
Thank you. Mark, I can't believe you're going to tell me that the voters is to blame. So why don't you tell me who is to blame?
I'm going to shock you and say that no, I don't think the voters are to blame. I think that I mean, again, I kind of concur with Sam that I don't necessarily think that there's a huge amount of mileage in saying who can we put up against the wall and give a few lashes for this in terms of what's happened. We didn't focus more on identifying what the solutions might be. But I would say that from my point of view, there's been a market failure in British politics. Like if British politics was British national politics was a market, it'd be heavily distorted, right? Like the fact that in 2019 the country was asked to choose between having a government run by Jeremy Corbyn or a government run by Boris Johnson is indicative of a failure, right? Like you can't ultimately blame voters for that. That is that a lot of that comes down to actions which I would lay at the door of the elite within the political class and within the media class, and the because those are the people who are ultimately responsible for the politicians that we get and the failure to make any changes to that political system to make it a more lively marketplace. It has suited those people. The system. The people who are within that system have benefited from its continued stagnation, and so they have not done anything to disrupt that. So, if anything, yes, you can certainly ascribe blame to people who have sat in various, pretty important jobs in politics and in the civil service and the media, and not asked themselves any of these fundamental questions or tried to do anything about it, partially because the incentives for them are in the place of keeping it exactly where it is, right up to the point where the complete consent of the body politic crumbles and the whole thing comes to pieces around us, and then people will be sitting at North London dinner parties going like, how did that happen? What was it? How did they get it so wrong? So yeah, like I think that there's blame to go around in terms of a failure of the political and media elite to reckon with these things. But ultimately, like, now we have to be thinking about engaging with bigger and different ideas, but about what things we can change from where we are to deal with that. And in reference to some of the challenges that there are in terms of demography and the questions of what is actually sustainable and achievable economic growth that we could look at as a country. I think that you don't want to get too starry-eyed about this, but like Daniel Susskind's book on this last year was pretty good, or I thought was pretty good, and had a strong message in terms of the fact that real transformative growth come from things that you can't see yet, because they're ideas that haven't necessarily been developed to their full potential or even brought to fruition. You have to encourage the ideas ecosystem, encourage the innovation ecosystem, and that's where ultimately we'll hopefully find the really transformative stuff.
Okay, so it sounds still like the political and media elite, and it's good to see some of them in the room so they can hear that bit. I guess final take. Whose fault is it, Ryan?
Oh, who's to blame?
Who's to blame?
Ed Miliband.
Far more specific answer than I was expecting.
Well, the system, the people, that's all very vacant. Like, come on. No, that's facetious. I mean, there is just a rose gallery of villains in politics and in business who have just done terrible things to our country for the last 20 years or so. And there should be some accountability to that. I think that, this is one specific example. I think net zero has been a big part of the problem, at least as it pertains to the sort of area that I fetishistically focus on, which is industry and manufacturing. I think if we were going to focus on net zero, we should have split it between like explicit austerity right? Where we say, we're not going to do this industrial development, we're not going to build this data center because we value the environment more in this specific case. And then the rest should have been research, right? For more speculative ventures, maybe, much more advanced, solar photovoltaics and so forth. Unfortunately, we kind of built it into our industrial policy on the basis that it was going to provide a huge windfall in green growth. Just like, for basic things, the wind turbine manufacturing industry in the UK is around like 2/3 of the turnover of the fish and mollusk processing industry. And, I think fish and mollusk processing is really good. I'd like to see more of it in Britain. I think we should be really self-sufficient in that domain. But I don't think we should build our entire industrial policy around it, or, at least not all of it. And I think, that delusion has really skewed, where, we've gone in terms of industrial thinking. And it's one of the reasons, right, why we actually put carbon taxes on power plants that are generating electricity when our whole strategy is to electrify. Like France has really pushed on heat pumps in a way that we absolutely haven't. And the simple fact of the reason is that it's not actually much more expensive in France to produce electricity than to burn gas. In the UK, it's about 4 times as expensive. So, even with these subsidies of about, £7,000 per pot, heat pumps just aren't very competitive, right? And so why are you taxing electricity generation that is going to try and reduce that deficit? So, yeah, I think what's to blame? I guess if I'm saying net zero, vague positive visions of the future, and that started in 2008 with Labour, but the Tories really turbo accelerated that, and they engaged in cakeism more than anyone. So yeah, I think while net zero can't be really to blame for even the majority of the problems related to growth, I think it's a fairly decent component, at least for quite a lot of key sectors.
Fair enough. Sam, you want to come quickly?
I just wanted to double down on that final point, which is if you could think about decarbonization on 2 levels. One is the amount of energy in the economy that is used from electricity, and one is how carbon intensive is electricity generation. And those 2 things are inversely related. The more carbon intensive, or the more you try to remove carbon intensity from electricity, the more expensive electricity becomes. And so the less inclined people are to shift from non-electricity forms of energy to electricity. So the Clean Power 2030 target, which is an attempt to move to, it was originally 100% clean energy. Then they realized that that's almost literally impossible. To now it's 95%. The Clean Power 2030 target will actually significantly undermine efforts to reduce carbon output overall by driving up the cost of electricity. People will be much less likely to buy electric vehicles, they'll be much less likely to buy heat pumps, because we have decided to focus on decarbonization of electricity rather than electrification of energy use. And I think it's a really, really important case where even on the terms of net zero, even on the terms of the government that is prioritizing decarbonization massively more highly than almost any other country in the world, they are doing it in a way that will hamper their own efforts. I think it's very, very important.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to go to questions, and we're going to take at least one, if we've got time, a couple from Slido. I think the voters are to blame, but I'm going to go with their choice of top question and ask, can each panelist give one idea / change that would be effective and deliverable within one parliament? And I'm going to hold you to specific ideas rather than kind of very, very generic ones. Mark, why don't we go with you first?
If we're going to talk about, are we talking here about moving the needle on growth, or specifically my diagnosis of why we end up here on a more macro level?
I'm going to say we're going to stick roughly to growth, right? That is the title of the panel.
Yeah, I think the single biggest thing that we can do in this parliament to drive growth is everything that we need to do through the planning system to get things built in the UK, and that does not that there is this kind of view that like we've just done the planning infrastructure bill and that like this will go through Parliament and then it'll be like we're done with like dealing with planning. Like it's just not even close. Like that is there's so much basically growth GDP left on the table that we can attain by being much more radical on that in a number of different ways. I think that putting planning as number one. Obviously, Sam's already kind of made clear like there's an interaction between regulation and planning, and
if you're going to say regulation is two, you're only allowed one.
Okay, fine.
So I'm going to leave some red meat for the other panelists.
I'll die on the hill of planning then.
Fantastic. Sounds like another planning and infrastructure bill coming courtesy of the Labour Growth Group. Looking forward to that one. Ryan.
Yeah, so I think I'd, as a sort of medium-sized policy, prioritise import-export financing, specifically for machine tools and robots. Britain, in terms of automation, the measure is the number of like robots per 1,000 manufacturing workers. And Britain is not merely less automated than its European colleagues or America or East Asia. It's actually below the world average, and that's depressing. Like that's really low par. And I think a big reason for that is, one, we don't have many really big industrial operations and buyers who can buy these things in bulk. We don't have a great system integrator market because robots, despite it, don't come out of the box and then just work. They actually need a lot of engineering in order to function and go properly. So I think if we were to do industrial policy, rather than put government subsidies in loads of little things, like I think a much bigger overall subsidy to the nation for trying to get imports for CNC machines, robots into manufacturing operations and try to automate more of these tasks, I think would be a good thing. You could even expand that to hiring like Japanese engineers on a consultancy basis as some sort of government program and trying to help them improve efficiency in British plants. I think that's something that would be pretty achievable pretty quickly. It would require not much changes to legislation. And it could all be wrapped up in our 5% defense of GDP figures, right? So, yeah.
I'll just get you stuck that second one in the end, but I'm going to allow you to. So subsidy for advanced manufacturing automation and an advanced market commitment for Japanese consultant engineers. Sam?
If you're a local council and a new business sets up in your area, the business pays a tax to you called business rates. Business rates 100 years ago, or what existed in their place 100 years ago, would have gone entirely to the local council. So if a prison opened up in Wandsworth, the prison would pay the equivalent of something like £500,000 a year to Wandsworth Council. Wandsworth Council would get this lovely bit of money, and it would somewhat offset the problem of having a prison in your local area. There would be some reason to want a prison in your area. For various reasons to do with equality and to attempt to kind of level up different parts of the country, today local councils retain less than half of the business rates bills paid by businesses in their area. Now, reforming that to make it much more close to 100% is something that I think would be very good, but also impossible politically. I think it's basically impossible to put the genie back in the bottle. But I think we may be able to do that for new businesses that set up in local authorities. And if we're really trying to be conservative and we're trying to be scalpel-like and really make this the absolute minimum viable policy, we could target it at specific types of infrastructure that we consider to have national benefits but significant local costs. For example, data centers, maybe prisons, maybe nuclear power stations, maybe other forms of electricity supply like transmission towers. So we could very easily say all new data centers built in the UK, 100% of their business rates bill is retained by the local authority. That would cost nothing. The Treasury would lose no money. In many cases, there wouldn't even be a loss kind of in expectation because most of these projects wouldn't get built without this. And that would give local authorities a much stronger incentive to allow things to be built in their area. We haven't really talked about AI and data centers much at all. I think data centers are the kind of easiest thing to think about because they're physical, they relate to the same sorts of problems we've been talking about. And I think doing this in a really, really focused way could get through the Treasury, could get through the existing incumbency problems that we have, and if focused on the right pieces of infrastructure, could be fairly transformational.
Fantastic. Thank you all. I am going to give people in the room who've maybe not done Slido a chance to ask their questions directly. Yeah, David at the back.
Mark mentioned the second staircase problem. I sort of assume, despite the fact that it's obviously sort of a dysfunctional policy, I assume it hasn't been reversed by either the previous government or this government. And I want to ask why that is the case, if it's so obviously dysfunctional. Is it because there's an avoidance of harm ratchet in so much of public policy? You know, once a welfare benefit or a regulation is in place, then it creates a whole set of vested interests to keep it in place, and removing it or abolishing it is very politically costly, requires political courage that is in short supply. I mean, is that broadly the right answer?
I think you've probably answered the question in asking it there, but I'm going to give maybe Mark just a quick on the political side an opportunity, a right to reply.
Yeah, I mean, I think like question answer, like political courage is the challenge with it. There will be efforts and discussion around how to mitigate or to reverse some of the effects of that policy has had. It goes back to the feedback loop that I talked about. Like there will be terrible articles in the Guardian that will scare the pants off people in Parliament about the relation of this to Grenfell and what it means from the politics of that. So it requires being up for a fight and being resolute about the reasons why you're doing it and being really clear about that. And that's just something that it's much harder to get that than it should be. But I would say don't give up yet. We've got 4 years still to do some of this stuff.
Sounds desperate to come in very quickly.
I think our political agenda has to be fight-free. I think that unless we ourselves are elected representatives, I think we cannot ask other people to essentially burn their careers for the sake of what we want them to do. So I think the challenge is coming up with solutions that do not involve political fights. I think in this case, the answer is create different ways of approving building that are carved out from the existing system. And have some legitimacy built into those ways of approving things. So my preference is local votes that have a lot of local legitimacy because, for example, they require supermajorities that can approve things that can go through a different channel to the existing thing. I think we're never going to get rid of the second staircases rule, but I think we may be able to create different forms of regulation or kind of different parallel paths to getting things built that are just different and kind of carved out from the completely broken stuff that we've got.
Fantastic, thank you. We're going to take one more. Yeah, Georgina at the back.
Thank you. So if we assume that AI will transform large parts of our services economy, which it probably will, in the next 5 years, are we about to see a levelling down of the south compared to the north of England? And if so, what do you do about it?
Fantastic. Ryan, I might give you an opportunity to come in on this first, because this might be a kind of levelling up for your sectors, right?
In what sense?
You just sold us on the idea that robots are going to solve it all.
Oh, well, no, hang on. There's a big difference between industrial robots raising the relative productivity of a factory and fully replacing human work. Like lights out factories aren't really sort of a thing at the moment. What like automation has like actually been doing for countries like East Asia, places like East Asia and countries like Singapore and South Korea and so forth, is that it's allowed them to retain relatively low and mid-value added industries, right, while reducing the workforce, but keeping the profit margin stable, right? And that's sort of where like Britain's not succeeded. Britain's manufacturing sector is actually incredibly profitable relative to others because it has to be, because it's so impossible to do manufacturing here. In terms of leveling down and AI service sector roles, I don't know, like we'll see with AI, like they've got a lot to say for themselves. Like, ChatGPT is an interesting tool. I, kind of use it more than I do like Google search now. And like, it's kind of comparable, I suppose, to Excel, maybe, like in terms of its impact, over the next 10, 20 years. If you get a big rundown of if you get a big windfall in unemployment among, highly qualified service professionals, Do we have to worry about that? Like, I mean, like, they'll move into like other employment, and that'll be fine. I don't think that there's like going to be like a massive like fall in employment among service professionals in London, right?
I mean, I hope not for those of us on this panel, right? Most of us write for a living,
And you can't you can't automate fake jobs anyway. So no, so.
God, I wish this wasn't being filmed. Anyone else want to come in on the subject of AI, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it makes sense to think about. Obviously, it's very difficult to tell what the path of AI is going to be. Even if we get something that we're all comfortable calling AGI. Even if we get something that is like having a human being in a computer, and at that point, like having 1 trillion human beings in a computer. Even then, it's not clear which characteristics that will have of human beings that will have. It may be that it's incredibly good at taking direction, but it's very bad at taking initiative, or it's very bad at having agency. Or it may be that we find that we're amazingly good at building AIs that can give us information and can give us insight, but are very, very bad at like identifying new patterns or identifying new relationships between kind of insights. Like, for example, Dwarkesh Patel, who's the kind of chronicler of AI at the moment, has pointed out that it's quite remarkable that we still haven't had a scientific discovery from an AI, right? We haven't had an AI just say like, here is a thing that happens in this area of biology. Here's another thing that happens in this area of biology. These things are clearly connected, and it may just be that we haven't got good enough models yet, or it may be that there are things inherent to the human brain that we're not going to be able to replicate. All of that is a way of saying I think there will be things that are scarce that AGI doesn't put the price of down to either zero or whatever the marginal cost of compute and energy is. And then the question is like, what are the complements? What are the things that we have that complement what AI does and that AI cannot do? I think it's certainly true, and I think kind of physical work, physical labor, doing things physically is massively underpriced by people who think a lot about AI. A lot of people, I think, seem to kind of just assume we'll solve robotics overnight, and that's possible. But if we're in a world where we're solving robotics overnight, we've also probably solved superintelligence overnight. The path that they imagine to solving robotics runs through creating God. In that case, I kind of feel like economic projections are sort of pointless. Like if we're in the superintelligence and completely abundant robotics world, then we're in such a science fiction world that it's kind of pointless to think about. If we're in a world where we don't just solve everything and we overnight make kind of a physical scarcity go away, then yes, the returns to physical labor will increase massively. Yes, I think we may end up with plumbers being paid the equivalent of £500,000 a year or £1 million a year, and that's a wonderful world. But I also think we'll have what you might call cognitive labor, a horrible term because physical work involves a lot of thinking and physical work involves a lot of skill as well. But kind of non-physical labor will probably also have, I think, things that we have not directly replicated with AI. A final point that I have come round to what I consider to be a really cringe point of view, which is that I think people really do value human beings being on the other side of a lot of their commercial relationships. I don't like that when I'm going to Sainsbury's. I prefer the self-checkout at Sainsbury's. But I do like that when I am speaking to a person who's looking after my child, or when I am speaking to an illustrator. I think Midjourney is absolutely wonderful, but I still feel, and I believe my readers still feel, a sense of kind of hollowness or emptiness from images that they know to be generated by AI. Not because the images themselves are not good enough, but because part of enjoying a piece of art is understanding that a human being has invested something in that piece of art and invested meaning in that piece of art. So there are lots of things that may end up being scarce that are either inherent to AI that simply, literally, unless it's conscious, unless it genuinely has feelings and thoughts, cannot be replicated because only human beings have that, or just practically AI has not been able to, or we haven't valued the production of certain things, or we haven't been able to replicate certain things that human beings can do that are just still scarce in an AGI world.
I'm conscious I'm literally about to get cut off by the team because we're about to overrun, but one final question from me, and I want yes, no answers from each panel member. In the next 10 years, in this country, are we going to return to 2% real terms GDP growth a year? Yes, kind of yes or no?
Yes, but if it's only 2%, then we've done something wrong. It should be 5%.
Anyone else? Yes, and or a sentence afterwards.
Yes, if the Labour Growth Group gets the positioning in UK politics that it deserves.
What to see, Ryan?
Yes, with the sufficient stimulus package. Yeah.
All very different kinds of yeses. That's all we've got time for. So thank you very much, everyone, and please thank the panel.